discussion. So, well, okay, so to get us started, I'd like to ask each of you how you see gig volunteerism functioning in your organization or personally. I know that some of you have touched on it a little bit, but Mike, do you want to get started since you're on my screen?
Yeah, sure. As someone who's been very interested in technology and platforms, and having had a background of leading a Habitat for Humanity affiliate, this question has always kind of pestered at me, is that how do we invite people into a community and not prescript exactly what they need to be doing? And so that's led to two things at this organization. Number one is project-based volunteering. So the idea is that gig volunteering, which we call project-based volunteering, is a great way for people to do very distinct, specific projects that can last as briefly as 1 hour, but can last 30 hours, is a great way to invite the intellectual capital of volunteers, give them a specific project that has an end point, because a lot of people get nervous about volunteering. If it's, hey, can you join my committee? Oh my gosh, that's frightening. But if you can join something and you know that it's going to be this distinct amount of time, and also making clear what the objective of the volunteering is. So those things can lead to a really rich experience for the volunteers. In the end, what we look for is that the richness that the volunteer leaves behind is something that the volunteer gets as much out of in coming here to work with us. So I'll just close with an example. We are just finishing up one project-based volunteer. He spent his whole career in the NSA, a project manager, and he was our volunteer coordinator. And he did research and did the design. And now we're on the verge of hiring a formal volunteer coordinator, but that came about because an NSA retiree chose to spend probably 100 hours with us over the past 4 or 5 months, really deciding what will our program look like. So it wasn't one of us, some nonprofit staff person, it was someone in the community with all of you that actually shaped what this organization is going to look like. So that's one of the ways that we think about gig volunteering.
Great. Andy, any comments?
Yeah, I like to think about volunteering and volunteerism in terms of what it does to the volunteer. During our work years, for many of us, we spend a third of our life in a social group where we work. And when we retire, we lose those, for the most part, we lose those social contacts on there. And depending upon one's family, one's personality, that loss can have a devastating impact upon the nervous system. It can be a stress that affects all sorts of functions in the body, the immune system, the lack of sleep. It could lead to depression. It's been found in 2018 AARP study that 1 in 3 American adults 45 years of age and older are lonely. So I see volunteerism as a way of dealing with that loneliness. Now, social isolation and loneliness are not identical things. They are overlapping. Social isolation is a quantitative. You can count the number of people that is in your social group in regular contact. Loneliness is more of an emotional response. One can have a low number of social contacts and not be lonely. A person can have a large number of social contacts and still be lonely. So I see volunteerism as a way of dealing with this and helping the individual's brain in terms of keeping it active. Uh, we know for the muscle system, we say use it or lose it, and research in recent years has shown that the use it or lose it concept applies to the brain. We have to keep challenging the brain with something new, learn something new. Um, the data show that social isolation uh, can is associated with a number of disorders. Dementias, Alzheimer's disease is one that area that I had been working with. Cognitive decline is impacted by social isolation, as are a number of other conditions, cardiovascular conditions, immunological conditions, response to infections on there. So I think that while being a volunteer contributes to the organization, it much more contributes to the individual and to the individual's sense of contribution to the society that he or she lives in. So that's my interest on it as a scientist as well.
Yeah, that's, I never thought about the distinction between social isolation and loneliness. It is a very, it is a distinction, right? Like you said, your comment about how you can have a large social network and still be lonely. So Jenna, you're kind of in the middle, kind of seeing both sides by the population that you serve. So thoughts and comments?
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking the same thing. I could, what Mike was saying very much resonated with me from an organizational perspective, and thinking about how we utilize volunteers and what are meaningful experiences, along with organizationally, what do we need in terms of volunteers, and how do we retain volunteers, is a challenge at times, and that recruitment. And then hearing Andy talking about the social isolation and the loneliness piece, a big part of our strategy around bringing awareness around social isolation, as well as how do we address social isolation. We see volunteerism as one of those strategies that we want to employ, and to provide engagement opportunities around, to really increase that social participation, and ideally then decrease that social isolation and sense of loneliness. So I see it both from a micro and a macro perspective. And yet our organization, being a governmental agency, is really at a crossroads, right? As we're talking about kind of the baby boomer population, and what folks are looking for, and what people want out of volunteerism, as well as how do we shift our own perspectives internally around how we really can utilize volunteers, and bringing our teams up to speed in terms of what these volunteer opportunities can be, and that it doesn't have to be that committee like Mike was talking about, like this huge commitment. And yet I almost kind of contradict myself, because one of our major volunteer opportunities is the Commission on Aging, and that's a 5-year term commitment. Actually, 3 years now. It's been reduced a little bit, but probably not likely seen as quite a gig, And so there's a lot of opportunity here, yet we need to understand what the community is looking for. Really, I seek to learn more about, and the Age Friendly Initiative has actually been really fantastic from that perspective of developing these action plan recommendations around where our community sees volunteerism heading, and what is important to really be able to use volunteers throughout our community. But specifically within our Office on Aging and Independence, we have a variety of gig opportunities that Some are very, very well established, like I was mentioning the SHIP program, our ombudsman program, where they are rooted in needing subject matter expertise that require highly trained volunteers, which training is, can kind of be a double-edged sword as well, because that leads to that sort of longer sense of commitment. And then we also have some really fabulous opportunities that are more short-term limited, kind of leading peer support groups, mutual aid support groups through our Seniors Together program, even leading evidence-based programs where you're teaching your peers about perhaps living with chronic disease and also or preventing falls. And then we have some fun opportunities, such as our Cycle to Health, where people can lead bicycle rides, and if they only want to lead one ride, they can do that. And it's a way to learn about your community in a whole new way. Personally, I see, I have the great opportunity to work within the community where I live, and prior to this position, I was commuting down to DC, and what I have been able to learn and be a part of as a result of working within my community, volunteering within my community, I've learned more in these last few years about what's meaningful to me, but then also meaningful to our community as a whole, by having these opportunities to engage both on that micro level and then also on this macro level. So that I see gig volunteerism as this way of creating social connectedness on many, many levels, and to really strengthen, similar to what Mike was saying, and to use it as a way to strengthen our community as a whole.
Great. The side question kind of came to me as all you were talking. So a couple things. One, we know we're a bedroom community where a lot of people work outside of the county and don't really know about it. So it can be challenging to get started. But also that, their social network is at work, which is now outside of their main geographic area. Is there any way, through the volunteer opportunities to help strengthen those social connections for the volunteers? Like, so if they're coming to you with a small social network, because most of it was work related, is it natural within the volunteer opportunity that you're going to build connections with other people, or do you consciously try to build those opportunities for that connection? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it depends on what the volunteer role is, and if it's more in a group type setting versus, and where you're engaging with multiple people versus perhaps, using a very specialized, like graphic artist who it is more project based, and maybe that network would be limited, or that interaction with that network would be limited. But I think that those types that volunteerism is a mechanism to build that network, and that as Andy mentioned, that volunteerism can be so significant during life transitions, and that it doesn't just have to be as part of retirement that people can seek volunteer opportunities. And I think that that's part of what is so appealing about gig volunteerism, is that it can be what you make it. It can be and there can be many, many opportunities along the way, and it can, that short-term piece is a great way to dip your toes into volunteering, and using that network that you tap into to perhaps help inform maybe what your next step is, or where you would like to go with volunteerism, with building out that network, and both from a social perspective as well as from that volunteer perspective. So there's so many benefits, right?
Yeah.
I was just going to say that one of the ways we're looking at volunteering is that the social is as important as the work. So we are actively thinking about how do we build a community around our volunteers. So it's not just the work for Luminous, but it's going to be doing things like doing embassy visits in DC. It's going to be things like hearing from guests who are experts in human rights. Anything we can do to cultivate relationships between people that are volunteers creates a network that strengthens the social capital in the community. And the more tightly that social capital is woven, the stronger the community gets. I mean, really restoring, Columbia to kind of the aspiration that I learned about with Leadership Howard, right? So that's a way that we're looking about it. And when I was back in my days at Habitat, volunteers that were regular were called red hats. And so those red hats would be among the most loyal, and they built relationships with each other and friendships, and the Christmas parties and all of that were really key to making the organization what it was.
That's a fabulous idea too, to add it's sort of an educational component to it. So people might come with a lot of experience in your area, but they might not have any. And it's just, one thing that people constantly want to do is learn, right? So to be able to volunteer, learn some more or something new, and also make connections and have exposure to things that you might not normally get, like embassy visits, is just the really clever. And it's really expanding like you said, what it means to be a volunteer.
I'll just share real quick. There's a Michelangelo, since we're talking about Italy tonight,
Yeah.
and Andy is off the coast. There's a Michelangelo quote that's Ancora imparo, I think it is, which means I am always learning. And supposedly Michelangelo said this not when he was a young man, but when he was 87 years old. And one of the things that you can see, even just going to Italy and seeing all the painters, is the brilliance of many of the painters was that they were always learning. That is an asset that is cultural capital that can be a part of who we are as a community.
Yeah, fantastic point. So Andy, along those lines, tell us a little bit about your transition to retirement. I know a lot of people are always asking, well, how do I find these opportunities? How do I figure out what to do? And, a little bit about what volunteering and being a volunteer has done for you, particularly around your comments about, social isolation and connectivityness.
Sure. In my last year or two at work at NIH, we had access to a number of seminars on retirement and planning for retirement. And I took them, and they were interesting seminars. And then I retired, and much as the first year of my retirement was spent catching up on sleep, drinking a leisurely cup of coffee in the morning and reading the newspaper, until my wife said, "You got to do something, challenge yourself, get out of the house." And I happened to see an ad in the Columbia Flyer from Holly asking for volunteers. And I thought that was interesting, because I was getting interested in the environment. I had been on a post-retirement cruise down to Antarctica, and one of the lecturers there was a climatologist from Columbia University, and at that time I was kind of skeptical about climate change. It's just something that's a natural cycle, was my thinking. And he presented data, what I found was very compelling data. So I decided I wanted to learn more about climate change and environment. So I became a member of Holly. I made social contacts that are strong today, some 8 years after I finished the Holly training. And I learned about Howard County. And that was important to me because I started attending some of the county council meetings and thought, hey, this is the way democracy works. People from the public are expressing their viewpoint, and the county council is listening to it and acting upon it. And so that was my introduction to Howard County, because prior to that, Howard County was someplace that I lived in since 1985, and it was someplace I slept and I ate, but I really didn't interact with Howard County. I didn't really realize what a vibrant place Howard County was. My primary area of interaction was Bethesda. That was it. So uh, so I made links with other groups in my Holly years, and then continued making links with other people. I'd like to go back in time to a experience that I had when my father retired, and he moved down to St. Petersburg, Florida. Now, St. Petersburg, Florida at that time was not what it is now. It was a place when I'd visit, there'd be a lot of old people sitting on park benches, reading newspapers or sleeping over their newspapers because they were just waiting to die. And I thought to myself, this is not what I want to do, and this is not the way society should be on there. Uh, and I've come over the years at the NIA to come up with 8 words for successful aging. Um, it is think young, act young, think old, grow old, which I think shows the importance of attitude as one ages on there. Certainly, we have physiological changes, physical changes with aging, but it's very important not to think of ourselves as being old and what that connotates. I think if you think yourself old, you're going to act old. If you think of yourself young, you're going to act young. And uh, on these cruises, you see a variety of older people. Some are old, and others are growing old, but they're not old yet. And that, even though they have the same chronological years.
Yeah.
So uh, my activities reached the point where my wife was saying, why don't you get a job so you have more free time on there? And one can get enmeshed in these activities, but I feel that it's worth it, as I said, for the individual.
Great. Thanks. That's a great motto to live by. Think young, act young, think old, act old. I mean, we all have our young 90-year-old grandmother or mother and our old 82-year-old mother. You know, it really is a lot of it in your mental state. Jenna and Mike, I know you guys highlighted a little bit on some of the advantages to the individual about volunteering, but I'm curious as to what you see from an organizational structure or goals standpoint, the advantage of using volunteers in your organization, as well as what might be some of the challenges you face, bringing somebody in who isn't, entrenched in the organization and understands how it works and conducts its business.
Yeah, so I can start. We would not be able to reach our community in the same way, serve the thousands of people who we do without our volunteers. They are critical to our operations and our programs, and as I shared earlier, in a variety of roles. And in some of our most impactful programs, really rely on volunteers who are able to convey complicated policy, complicated and complex information, and to be able to break that down in a way that is easily understood. And our volunteers help to create access, to information and to education, to be able to make informed decisions around aging in community, around what options exist. And we would not be able to serve who we do and meet our mission as the local area agency on aging without these critical volunteers, and having a variety of skill levels and abilities to engage with our community as a whole. I mean, it's critical to our mission. Additionally, just other advantages is really, and we have talked on that micro level about what's meaningful for the volunteers, but it's really it's our volunteers find value engaging with older adults, with their peers, and our community as a whole. And I think that there's a greater sense of purpose as a result of being able to use their expertise, to be able to use their life experiences to help others, to support a community, and not to be cliche, but to truly give back. And there's that makes a difference on many levels for our organization, as well as on that individual level.
I would say for me, the way people typically look at nonprofits is that the people that work at nonprofits are there for the mission. They're not there to be an accountant. They're typically not there to be a financial person. They're not there to, do these various other roles that are functionally necessary for nonprofits. So nonprofits oftentimes have a really weak infrastructure, have a lot of passion. So going back to your question, what's essential for volunteers is to welcome volunteers who have skills outside of the traditional skill set, but share a passion for the mission. We have had volunteers in the past year help write our budget. We had a high school student working with a CPA that essentially developed our budget with our guidance, but that was far better than any staff member, including me, that developed a rigorous, impressive budget that blew away the board. That's an example of how a volunteer can make a difference. The way for nonprofits is to think about how volunteers can use and engage their own talent and skills and bring that into the organization to add to the infrastructure and durability of the organization. You asked about the challenge as well, and I would cite two. The first is that, and I'm not, this is just a stereotype, but I think it has truth. A lot of times when there is almost certainly tension with some retirees who will come into a nonprofit and really know what they need to do to set things right. We had an experience about 6 months ago with a retiree from a prominent business who really turned off a lot of staff because he came in and he said, this is what you need to do. But I think it's important for an executive director to develop a tolerance if somebody comes in with that personality, because they may actually have points. In this case, it wasn't done respectfully, so it probably wasn't a good experience, but that is a place of tension. The other place of tension is trying to work with staff to help them embrace volunteers, because a lot of staff sometimes feel like, man, this is just going to be too much work to work with so-and-so, and that it's going to be better if I just do it myself. So to hire a good volunteer coordinator who can kind of be a bridge and help staff break out their jobs into more rigid segments and then assign those segments to volunteers and then develop a culture of welcome for volunteers. If you do that, then that can help overcome some of the challenges, because those challenges exist for volunteers, and no volunteer wants to come into an organization and feel like they're not welcome. And it's important for the executive director to convey that everyone that walks in that door, be they a client, beneficiary, volunteer, donor, it doesn't matter, but you need to throw your arms open to everyone that comes through that door. And only then can you create social change.
I like that about, you can't create social change until you welcome everybody, no matter from what base they're coming from. Jenna, what about, do you see, are there any challenges, as a governmental agency? Obviously, you have a lot of policies and a lot of rules, legislations, that you have to follow. You don't have a choice about. How do you overcome that kind of obstacle when dealing with volunteers?
Yeah, so I think it's really important to be clear about what the intent of the role is for the volunteer, depending, and the responsibilities of the volunteers, including the training requirements as set forth with the policy or the programs. Some of our training requirements as a governmental agency are set by the state. The Ombudsman program is a perfect example. And so ensuring that we make a good fit, and that we are also transparent around what the training requirements are, what the commitment is, and talking about what we have control over and what we don't. But one of our primary challenges is those constraints that you described, being part of a larger system. I love the idea of what Mike just mentioned about using volunteers, even a high school student, to work on a budget, versus in a governmental agency, we can't do something to that effect. There's certain, we have to be aware of how we can use volunteers. And at the same time, we need to recognize what our constraints are, and think about where we can impact, where can we be nimble and be innovative around plugging in a volunteer to do something, and also ensuring that we understand the layers and the decision points of how we bring in volunteers within our organization and within the governmental agency as a whole. And there's different flexibility depending on what role we seek to utilize a volunteer in. So I think that's primarily one of our challenges, and that as a result of not being able to be as nimble, sometimes people don't want to wait, or kind of go through the various requirements, because then it starts to feel like work, right? So and we understand that too. So that can be a challenge.
Okay. Another topic that sometimes comes up is, and this is for all of you, from both sides of the table, that a lot of people feel like in order to volunteer for an organization, their interest needs to align with their mission, or that, as you said, like you do have some roles where you do need to be a subject matter expert or have some, significant training in order to be that type of volunteer, but you do have other opportunities where they don't have to be a subject matter expert. So do you feel it's true that, like, from both sides, being the volunteer and being the person who utilizes volunteers, that the volunteer has to be a subject matter expert? And, well, let's just start with that first. I have a second question, but.
I'll start on this one. I would say absolutely not. That our job as nonprofits is to, as I said last time, welcome everyone. And so one of the exciting things is to make sure that when a volunteer approaches an organization, to really spend some time listening to them and what their interests are, and to see if there's a way to design something that meets their interests, but also meets the needs of the organization. That's not always easy to do, but if you can do it, you'll have a longer relationship with that volunteer, and you'll create more capacity for the organization that allows the organization to grow and serve more people in terms of quantity and quality.
I think one problem that I've observed is letting people know what the opportunities are for volunteers. I think it's a marketing problem. As I said, I learned about it because I read an ad in the paper on there. We have a large social network structure if people use it on there. But in order to have a diversity of volunteers, we need to get out to the various communities that we have within our county and to let them know how they can become volunteers, what is necessary, as pointed out, whether they have to have the specific skills or whether they can learn new skills, and what they can get out of being a volunteer. So I think that sort of market tiering is necessary. I've been very impressed by looking at the comments that come up in the app next door. All sorts of comments come up, and people will say, well, have you seen this dog? And there'll be half a dozen or more comments to that. So it's a possible source for spreading the news about what volunteer activities are and where people can become volunteers. Just one example of how to market more volunteerism.
I agree wholeheartedly with both Mike and Andy. There needs to be a goodness of fit. You don't have to necessarily be a subject matter expert, and it's the beauty of volunteerism is the opportunity to learn something new. And what I would also say is what we need to do better is getting the word out about those volunteer opportunities, and also being thoughtful about what our opportunities are. We need to recruit more actively. Right now, we advertise primarily on our website and by word of mouth. So thinking along the lines of, what are different strategies that we can employ, and the crowdsourcing that exists through listservs like Nextdoor is just incredible. I saw a post just yesterday on our local Nextdoor, and it seems like nearly every community within Columbia is connected via Nextdoor, about a woman seeking school supplies. And, within an hour, there are 20 different comments at a minimum of providing guidance and providing information on where people can, or where this woman could go to get free school supplies. And the power behind that community base and that knowledge is so significant. Yet what we need to catch up with as a governmental agency is how do we utilize those kinds of innovative community-based resources, and how and when can we use those, and so like you're talking about kind of challenges, and that's kind of one of those, just not to go back there, but to highlight, and that those the listservs are really a powerful way to communicate information, including how people can contribute and where these volunteer opportunities exist. And it's something that I hope that we can impact in a different way in the future.
One positive thing to come out of social media or social networking, would be that. Along this vein of, what advice would you give somebody who, to help them kind of explore and discover opportunities that might be outside of their, knowledge base, or, their sphere of what they know about in the county? I think that's a big challenge that a lot of people, one, you don't know what you don't know, and two, you don't always know where or how to get started. And we tend to focus on the things that we know. And what some people want to do, as you guys have illustrated, is expand and learn something new. So any advice on how people might start that, thinking about that, or some resources they might use?
One thing that we came up in the age-friendly initiative in our social participation work group was a program of ambassadors that would spread information locally within communities, within their neighborhood networks, and follow up on there. We know from a number of research in social sciences the importance of having a source that you trust in, that is a family member or a member of your religious faith, or a work associate that you have a degree of trust in there, in what they say. And this is something that possibly this ambassador program, if it gets off the ground, could help spread the word about opportunities throughout various communities.
So I know along that line too, that a lot of people are somewhat concerned about volunteering because they may travel frequently. They may go out of state for several months out of the year. Or, they just, they, they're afraid of committing to a long-term volunteer opportunity. And I think if COVID has taught us anything, it's that we can work effectively remotely, as evidenced by Andy here being, still being able to join in this conversation, being on the other side of the ocean. So what are your thoughts on, does a successful volunteer engagement, can it be project-based? I think you kind of highlighted some of that. Can it be, so maybe focus a little bit more on remote, and for those people who, we're talking about gig volunteerism, they're short term, but, how can somebody work effectively in the office, say, part of the time, and then continue helping remotely if they do travel or go, have a second home out of the area?
One of the things that we're doing is we're trying to blow up our office space and eliminate the idea of permanent offices for staff. And that the goal there is to open the door for volunteers to have spaces that they can physically come to. So our idea is to have hybrid experiences where maybe volunteers start their volunteer experience learning a little bit about us, getting started on the project, but then they don't need to come back. They can work remotely, and we give them access to Teams. We set up a Teams page for the project that they're working on, and they essentially can project manage with the staff member remotely, be they in Malta or any other part of the world. And that's something that we want to do so that we can have volunteers, helping us out in California, helping us out in Japan, helping us out wherever. And that's the vision, and we're getting there. That's important for organizations to get to.
I would just agree with that. Absolutely, volunteers can work remotely. We COVID blew this all out of the water, and now that we have this kind of technology, and that there is, and people are familiar with how to use the technology, we were able to successfully employ remote volunteers to provide counseling through our SHIP program last year. So really when COVID was kind of at its height, back in October of 2020, we were able to establish a whole process and system that was all electronically based, and even deploy laptops to our volunteers to be able to do that one-on-one counseling. So, you know, part of the solution and the success in being able to provide remote volunteerism is also like that, the equipment and the technology support that may be needed, or that access to that, either by the individual or by the organization. And then also AARP was a great model of utilizing remote volunteers to provide tax returns. And that also started in January. So we've had some proven models of being able to provide kind of time limited, remote based volunteer opportunities. And some of our volunteers actually prefer it, right? You know, there's a convenience to it for some, and even for people maybe who have functional impairments or not able to, or have transportation to get somewhere to volunteer. It creates whole new opportunities by thinking about including remote opportunities in addition to just in-person opportunities.
Some of the organizations that I've been involved with, such as Holly and the Watershed Stewards Academy, after your training period, your commitment is to work a certain number of hours per year on there. So it's not that you're committing to work 10 hours a week. You're spreading that time over a period of time. Now that depends upon the organization one is working for. So in an office situation, you might have to have more of a commitment of time, but you go to groups, as I mentioned there, and let's say the National Aquarium, which uses a lot of volunteers. Depending upon the organization, you're much more flexible as having a gig job versus having a regular schedule on there. So I think that depends upon the needs of the organization.
To circle back to the kind of opening conversation about social isolation, you know, there's some people believe that working remotely decreases social connectivity among people. And if people are volunteering as a way to stay socially connected or build new social connections, what is your thought process about trying to provide that social connectivity? You know, Mike, you were providing a lot of opportunities to go places that help build social connectivity. I'm sure some of those opportunities were probably, it might have been some webinar based too, but do you see that as a challenge? Or, you know, if social isolation is a major factor of, or avoiding social isolation, I don't know why I can't say this word tonight. Isolation is a key to successful aging. And if we move more remote, do you see that as being detrimental, not really an issue, or it could have positive aspects that we don't even think about?
I mean, if you're asking
I don't
me,
think we have.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't think we have the data now for the effects of social participation remotely versus social participation in place on there. The data does show that social participation, where you are actually interacting with others, has positive effects. I don't know if whether the data have been put together yet to see whether social participation remotely has the same effects or it differs significantly.
I was just going to say, to the extent that you can create hybrid experiences so that people get the opportunity to build relationship in person. I know that's limited by COVID, but it's not extinguished by COVID. And that the organization can facilitate relationships between people, even if it is remote. So an example of that is doing a project plan of an event and having people participate, or doing a project that may not be the type of project that one might normally think of with your nonprofit. It stimulates thinking, and if you have a good project manager on the staff, you give the volunteers the opportunity to take on different roles that are appealing to them. And so in that way, there are opportunities to create less social isolation, even if they're physically distant from one another.
Great. Well, I want to be respectful of everybody's time, and we're coming up on 10 minutes to the hour, and I'd like to give each of you the opportunity to add any final comments, advice that you might give folks listening about, how to engage in a volunteer opportunity, or, Andy, what benefits you feel like you've gotten from being actively involved throughout your retirement, and also open it up to the floor for any questions. I don't think I missed anything, but Andy, you want to go first?
Oh, yeah, sure. I've found it extremely beneficial for myself on there. I think it depends also in part for a person's personality, whether they are nerds, whether they are introverts or extroverts on there. And that also is related to the effectiveness of remote work. The data seems to indicate that people that are more introverts enjoy the remote types of interactions more than a person that's an extrovert. So the effects that would be beneficial to an individual are confounded by those personality characteristics. But as I said, it's important for an individual's health to be socially interactive. The data are there, and as I mentioned from my experience with my father's retirement, that is not something that we should aim to be. We have to go into the point that we interact and grow older better on there. So I end on those thoughts.
Thanks, Andy. Mike?
I just would invite any of you who have networks or you yourselves to get in touch with us to experience what it could be like to engage with us. And if you have passion at another nonprofit, I would say challenge that nonprofit to be better with volunteers. And you should, in my opinion, you should, if they don't meet your challenge, you should choose another nonprofit, because nonprofits are community institutions. They're not run by a CEO and shareholders. They're part of the community. And so to the extent you can be, explore and really choose organizations that welcome you and throw their arms open to you, that should be how you think about where you invest your valuable intellectual capital and precious time.
Thank you. Jenna?
Yeah, First of all, I'd like to just say thank you. I think this has been a really terrific conversation, and I've appreciated hearing Mike and Andy's perspectives on volunteerism, as well as just how we can shape volunteerism in the future, and creating that welcoming environment that's very needed. Um, my call to action is really, I would like to invite our attendees to get involved with our Howard County Age Friendly Initiative, and help influence and shape what volunteerism and social participation can look like within our county and for our community. And I would also like to encourage folks, if you're ready to volunteer now, to visit our website, which is hocovolunteer.org, and to get engaged, and to certainly reach out to us. But as a final thought, I really feel like we are just at such an exciting time and on the cusp of really transforming what volunteering can mean and be for both individuals and also for us who lead organizations. The whole idea of gig volunteerism, or we started talking about gig volunteerism probably a couple of years ago, Mary, and Pat, and it was really exciting to think about a paradigm shift as it relates to volunteerism, and how it can be mutually beneficial for the volunteers as well as our organizations, and how it can be different, and the rewards that exist as a result. So thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you, Jenna, Andy, and Mike, for participating. This has been a great conversation. I know I've learned a lot. I hope everybody else has learned a lot. We typically send out a follow-up survey after it, so we'll be sure to include contact information for Mike. I know he put it in the chat, and links to the website, contact information for the Office on Aging, and the sites that Jenna referred to. So I'm going to turn it back over to Pat now. And thank you, all of you, for coming and participating in our workshop. Pat, you're muted.
Harking back to what Jenna said, you think I know by now. So I just want to also express my thanks to this amazing panel. It was wonderful. It was wonderful to hear your thoughts on all of this. And my only last job is to let you know that we have a couple more workshops coming up. Ruth, I don't know. Wait, there she goes. Okay. We have a partnership with the AARP and the Maryland Pharmacy Association, and we're going to be having a conversation about drug pricing and how that occurs in September. Also in October, we're going to have a representative from another Legacy Leadership Institute, which is on public policy. Wesley Queen is going to be talking about legislation, public health policy, and its impact on the minority community in Maryland. Both of those are free. And in November, we will have a conversation around actually retiring, or as Jenna pointed out, transition, how to shape your next purpose. So think about that one as well. In the meantime, the last slide tells you how you can contact us. If you have anything that you want to tell us or ask us, please reach out to us. And thank you again. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Ruth. I think that went, what do you guys think?